Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another exciting installment of Umsamo Encounters. You're joined by myself, the host, Siyabonga Africa Mkhize, Managing Director of Umsamo Institute. Today, we're going to do things a little differently, and we're going to take a father and son approach with myself and my father, Dr. Vivio Mkhize, and my guests will also come with their father and son approach. Today, we want to discuss the development of a masculine identity, and of course, it's so fundamental that we speak about fatherhood and fathers and sons and their interactions, because essentially our masculinity and our manhood and the experience of being a man is shaped largely by our relationship that we experience with our fathers or our father figures. So tonight I'm joined by three incredible gentlemen, starting off with Mangaliso Vilakazi, the father of Advocate Chain Vilakazi, and the incredible Jamie Mighty, international public speaker, debater, and champion. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for taking time to join us on this show tonight.
Thanks for having us.
So I think let's begin by really discussing what manhood and masculinity is as two separate entities, so there's no confusion. So manhood, I understand that manhood is more the experience of being a male body, and not a boy child anymore. It's more of the encounter and the process of being a man, or the existence of being a man. And I think Moorman describes it beautifully when he says, masculinity, on the other hand, is the multiple shifting, fluid practices and performances of gendered bodies and identities. He then goes on to suggest that masculinity stands in relation and at the same time in opposition of femininity, and is largely organized through ideological discourse, but is not always attached to the male body. So we understand that masculinity is more of an identity from ideological processes. So to begin, Bab Vilakazi, can you please enlighten us on when he talks about the fluid and shifting practices that have formed the identity? Culturally speaking, where do these fluid and shifting practices come from?
Wow, very, very interesting. However, the masculinity, it's very descriptive for a male boy between manhood, but it describes the essential, the visible aspect of man, like what you call six packs and what have you. But it differs from manhood, because manhood then takes a form of responsibilities, parenting, because these are the aspect of masculine gender, as it were, vis-a-vis the feminine. Those are really attributes, essentials of definitions. However, when it comes to manhood, or fatherhood, as it were, then it differs. And I would imagine that, as you're saying, the cultural aspect and the shift, it's influenced by a number of stages. You'll then look back pre-94, as it were, which stage was also divided into various phases. If you look into the 60s, the 70s, the type of us then being boys, and then it shifted towards the 80s, as it were, where the schools, the changes, to a certain extent, within the apartheid regime. However, post-94, then things changed. The landscape, your social, cultural, political change. But maybe let me pause there, because I'll be tempted to begin to interrogate and divide the social, cultural as a package, and look at the political and see what came into fore that increased this divide to the extent. But I think I'll look into that.
I think, Jamie, you'd be perfect to come in there to separate the social, cultural, and the political, especially with your background in student politics and your work at the moment in the community and working with students. How has the change from pre-1994, let's call it that, to post-1994 influenced the gender roles that are attached to masculinity, their masculinity identity?
So I think firstly we have to realize that even though movement posits gender as being, masculine and feminine, there are a plurality of genders in between. So my social justice lecturer would be, he'd pull his hair out, Prof. Patrice, if I didn't mention that there is a fluidity of gender. So you'll have someone who is purely masculine, someone who's feminine, but there's a variety in between. And I think what South Africa has done post-1994 is to allocate rights to the queer community, and that has allowed for different expressions of gender, because gender is a social construct. But now when we're talking about the differences that have happened, I think there's more a continuation of a pattern, because what apartheid did, and the apartheid system, by putting men in the mines and creating these dual households, what it did is it broke the, let's say, the traditional patterns of fatherhood which used to exist pre the rise of mining, pre this need for black labor, because the apartheid system and the colonial system before realized that blacks had no interest in going into the city. They had no interest into going into the mines. Why go into a mine and die and labor for a white man for a pittance? So what did they start introducing? All of these tax systems, telling people that you needed money. Now that you need money and the white man is coming to collect the money, now you have to pay. And where do you get the money? You have to go get work for the white man because he has the money. So now you have to leave your rural home where you were satisfied and content, in an ecosystem where you understood the trade, the barter, and how to even get medication, etc. You have to either come to the city or you go to the mine. What did that actually do? It broke down the fundamental building block of society, which is the family. Because now you've got the man in the mine, and at some point these people begin to make compromises because they begin to develop relationships in the mining community where they spend most of the year and have a relationship at home. And what does that create? It creates all of these single father households in effect, because the parents are in the rural, the mothers in the rural areas raising the kids, or in the township raising the kids. The father is in the mines, or where the father is around. The culture has now become that the responsibilities which used to extend to men have been reduced. And that's why, in the absence of a father, you begin to see children who become morally deviant at a young age and then choose these patterns of behavior, such as violence, such as crime. Because I've never been, when I was in the townships, I've never seen a household where a kid chooses crime which had a father. Because the first time you steal, they tell your father, and you get the biggest hiding of your life. So what created the broken homesteads is this systemic application of separation, which apartheid instituted within the homesteads. So now we find ourselves in a continuity of that. And that's why our women are now saying, and they're not really our women, the women are now saying men are trash, because the expressions of male behavior come from these decades where men were living by themselves, exploring sexual adventures in the city away from their homes. And then with the advent of HIV and AIDS, these same kind of behaviors then bring AIDS into the household. Because a man has been at the mine, he's been in the city by himself, living with minimal responsibilities. But then he goes back home in December and he brings the infections that he got. That's why the HIV rates have been particularly high in the mining communities and also in the trucking communities. The communities where the men were forced to be away from the home for a very long time. So even talking about masculinity now and manhood, we have to be cognizant of where we're coming from. But not to blame and to say we don't have responsibility, but just to understand how we got here.
Yeah. Thank you. Jamie, you're touching on something which is, I know that's how you feel, but my engagement from the literature, what you're saying is actually supported by the statistics, in that they find if a child grows up without a father, they're more likely, there's more of the children that commit suicide, 60% of them come from fatherless households. Of those that are incarcerated, a higher percentage of them are ones that are coming from fatherless households. Now, before we expand on that one, Mangaliso, you spent quite a fair time in London, in the United Kingdom. Of course, their socio-political context is completely different to ours, and their history is different to ours. How has that shaped your understanding of father-son relations in South Africa in comparison to what's happening in what we would now call a first world country, according to their standards?
Sure. Thanks for that. See, I think one thing you need to consider is they have a commodity called time. So in a first world country, I think they afforded a little more time to be thoughtful in how one child is raised, in the principles you learn in the household.
How so? How do you mean by time?
So as Jamie had touched on, when fathers are being sent away to the mines, to trucking fields, that commodity is not just in a financial perspective, it's in a time perspective. So you have no time to watch your children grow up. You have no time to actually guide them in the challenges that they face in life. So the avoidance of that leads to people not actually being as stable as one would hope. So in a European context, you'll find that they are so much more likened to their parents because they have the time to spend with them. And you find that the relationships that they foster go through generation to generation to generation. Here you're finding there's a huge separation of morals. You might find one father viewing things one particular way and the child's viewing it completely differently. When did that happen? You need time for that to happen. So I'm finding that the major thing is the time for you to enforce your principles, your morality, and what you think. From a masculinity perspective, it's a lot more fluid because we use it in a South African context to protect ourselves. It's no different from a racial prejudice. It suits us as men to have certain masculinity. So it suits me as a man to say, should you not be in the kitchen? Why? Because that is a privilege which I think I deserve. Or is it because I have not gotten to the point where I'm strong enough to see past that? So what you usually find is the males who are now educated, who have now gotten to a certain point where they are, I would say, understanding, are usually the stronger in the household. So if I need to bring this example back to my household, my father he wouldn't choose who should clean up, who should cook, who should, if you were the male, you should protect your sisters. And that does not mean that you just do male-oriented jobs. You should cook, you should look after yourself, you should do everything you expect a female to do. Right? So I think in the European context, you find that happened a lot sooner, but they had a commodity called time.
Jamie, so he's just touched on the commodity or the privilege of having time. And you spoke beautifully about how money has been attached to fatherhood from the apartheid system. And one of the reports that I was reading on when they engaged children under the age of 35 is they found that they believe that to be a good father, I need to have money, and that all I can give is money. How has that impacted our emotional connection and the development of our EQ, emotional quotient, of our young men, if we believe all my father's good for is money?
Well, look, I think that also just comes from the historical standards we set for ourselves. There's a funny video going around on social media where this girl is trying to translate ubuhle bendoda busenkomeni zakhe, which is the beauty of a man is in his wallet, right, or wallet, so to speak. So she ends up saying she says the beautiful man is a cow. She's translating and then she loses herself. But I think growing up with that kind of instruction, that you have to generate revenue, you have to have such and such an amount of money. When you then merge that with the Western tradition, the expectation of what is a successful man has morphed. And I think very few people will be able to meet that standard. When you are engaged in societal conversations, this is the generic statement you'll hear. So-and-so is doing so well because they have got a new place in Sandton. They are using this latest iPhone, right? Not just the iPhone, it has to be the latest. They are working where, and the big one, they are driving this new BMW or Mercedes or Audi or VW Polo, right? Now, if you are living in a country where there is 60% poverty, 60%, people making less than 2,000 rands a month, right? Families making less than 2,000 rand a month. You've got to then ask yourself, how does the young man who's in a relationship where he is told, I'm pregnant, respond to that when he has already been told, firstly, he must have cows. And if he doesn't have cows, he must match with the standard of success. And the images of success that he's surrounded with is the soccer players, the rappers, the people who got through the education system and come back at Kasi, to braai and buy everyone beers. But that's not everyone. That's the minority, right? We, in the black community, I think we've got less than 10% of the community possesses a degree. So now if you then think about how many people can play soccer, how many people can be successful rappers, how many people can be in the professional community, considering that it is an untransformed community, what that then leads to, I think, is many people abdicating the responsibility of fatherhood because of the pressure of finance that has been placed on them. Because he doesn't know how to be on the ground and be a father. There are houses where there is a father, but there is poverty. But the presence of that father leads to long-term rewards for those
emotional
people.
wealth.
And kids sometimes don't even know that they are poor. Everyone who has been raised poor and succeeded says, I never knew we were poor. I was happy. I was playing with my bricks. I only discovered that I was poor when I went to high school. And there were maybe white kids at that high school when I got a scholarship. Because a child doesn't understand these capitalistic, materialistic standards. A child understands love, attention, right? And because the pressure has been put on men to go and get money, to go and do these things, the average black man now is uncomfortable with accepting a position of poverty, even if it's temporary. Yeah. So what do? And I'm not excusing the behavior. I'm trying to explain the psychosis. A man who thinks he has failed tries to escape. They either escape through the bottle or they run away from the situation. And I don't think we have enough conversations about the psychology of failure. Like, what makes somebody throw in the towel? We're often talking about depression, but very superficially. How does a depressed poor black man manifest that depression? If he's around being constantly reminded by society and sometimes by the people in his home that he is a failure, that he does nothing, that he's always sitting around, that he's going to escape and go be around other people in that same condition, right? And sometimes he's going to escape into drugs. Now, think about the conditions of our country, right? How many people never make it to the matric exams? We've got 1.2 million get into grade 1, 600,000 write the exam. Forget how many pass. 600,000 kids have disappeared from the system. They are unemployable. And 300,000 of those are likely to be boys. In fact, women graduate from high school more than boys do. We have to ask ourselves as a society, what then happens to those boys? How does their manhood then manifest? Because they're stuck in that gap between boyhood and manhood, because they've been told to be a man you must pay bills. But what happens in a country where you didn't get the educational skills to even make it to work at Edgar's or to work at Pick and Pay? Those boys then escape into perpetual boyhood.
If I may just quickly add to that, the issue of cash, wealth, vis-a-vis manhood or the masculine in you. I think we'll not be doing justice if we're to leave the political scene that we find ourselves caught up in. The inequality that now exists within our communities. I'm not talking about at the national scale or international scale. Black on black, that has now affected our boys, us as men. Because of some of the shortcuts that have been created within the political terrain of empowerment, that has done so much injustice to those that have gone to school who are unemployed with degrees and certificates. Those that have not been seen to be doing anything to build themselves up as responsible citizens. They are the ones that are driving big cars, changing this and this. That has put so much pressure to the boy child, to the father, to this husband. Because you correctly have said that it creates an impression of poverty, of being a failure. And therefore, we need to revisit even the sources the financial sources that are available as to how do we begin to embrace this change. Because it is very, very dangerous. The implications is that we end up without.
But I'm trying to understand, Uguti, lento ikamga, where does it come from? You know, I mean, speaking personally from home, it wasn't always the case where ubaba no mama were earning equally. You know, there was a time when things were a little difficult and we went through our slump, and there was a point where umama was the one earning a little bit more than ubaba. You know, and then na ubaba was sebenza njengendoda. But we never were cognizant of that at the time. We never realized, Uguti, there's this discrepancy in terms of salary. There's this discrepancy though in terms of money. So where is it coming from, Uguti manje? A man is determined, his manhood is in his wallet. That where does it come from where my bank balance is more important than the emotional wealth that I'm passing on to my child?
Well, maybe just before Mangaliso, I think the focus also, the pressure that we are talking about, is to cease to be me or to be yourself without being defined by the external, the attachments, these things that come and go. And they've put so much pressure to an extent that you will do whatever it takes to be seen to be successful. And then if you look at the kind of boys today that are, they shun educated women. They shun progressive women because now they are now in the marketplace. That was the terrain of men to be hunters, bring meat home. And that has now gone away. And the fright and the anger, the fear of being perceived to be a failure, I think the pressure is now on, especially the young guys, because some of us have been able to escape this because during our days, we look back and say, yes, but don't allow yourselves to be defined by the external, the attachments. And I think that's the gospel that...
I think you're actually touching on something that we're going to delve into deep into the second segment of the show when we come back, how men and women deal with successful and educational, empowered women, especially Jamie touching on the fact that we actually have more women that are becoming educated, and that the discrepancy and the gender wage gap, yes, it is there, slowly but surely is closing up. Ladies and gentlemen, sit there right where you are. We'll be right back. And in the second segment of Umsamo Encounters, we're going to talk about gender roles and how they influence our relations with men and women. Come back, join us, and engage in this conversation. The development of masculinity right here on Umsamo Encounters with your host, Umsamo Encounters.